Mary Frances, welcome to the show.
It's so good to be here, Tom. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. I came across your first book, The Grieving Brain, and really loved it. Really loved it. It's a different book for me to read actually because I've always learnt about grief from the mind's perspective, not necessarily the brain's perspective. But very, very revealing. But before we get into all of that, could you just give us a bit of a bit of a background, excuse me, as to who you are and what you do, and then we can go get right into it.
Well, by training, I'm a clinical psychologist and a neuroscientist, and I've been studying the body and the brain's response to the death of a loved one for, gosh, actually 25 years now. And my reason for being interested in that is both the scientist's curiosity, but also because I have known grief myself and it I feel comfortable with people who are grieving, I think, which is not the most common thing. And so being able to talk with people who are in my research studies is both a chance for me to understand their individual story, but also match it up with their MRIs and their blood tests and so forth.
Yes. Is it funny introducing yourself and telling people what you do at, say, for a party for because I imagine grief is something that often brings a lot of like distance between people sometimes. I mean, I think it's actually quite beautiful and it's quite beautiful to be in the presence of someone who's grieving. But yeah, what kind of reactions do you normally get?
I don't usually lead with I'm a grief researcher.
Yeah.
When people say what you do, I'll say, "Oh, I'm a neuroscientist," on the airplane or
Yes.
whatever. Um, but my experience is that actually we're always talking to kind of four possible groups of people. One is people who have not had grief in their life and they don't really understand what it's all about. And then we're talking with people who have found a way to integrate a really deep loss into their life and that they really get it and they really are able to sort of have those conversations. And then the groups of people who are in the middle of it, right? The early days of grief where you just feel completely like the rug has been ripped out from under you and you're really not certain about anything and you would really just like it to be over now.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then the group who are more in the trying to restore a life for themselves, but still really struggling with what that's going to look like,
Mm.
still not really able to see what it's going to be, even though the waves of grief may be less intense or less frequent now. But they're still trying to, what does retirement look like if I've always planned it with my partner? Or how am I going to get through college if my mom isn't there to cheer me on?
Mm. Mm.
So I'm always thinking as I'm having these conversations, kind of, where is this person at today?
Yes, yes, that makes a lot of sense. Well, that's a fantastic segue. So one of the things that really, really astounded me, I think, really, when I was reading your first book, was understanding grief from this perspective of someone's just sort of been extracted out of the brain, and the brain can't make sense of it. And it's
Yeah.
almost like I remember reading that, and I remember getting quite teary because I remember thinking, I mean, we've all been there before, right? As children, we can't find mum or dad, and we feel like we're
Yeah.
just lost in the shopping mall or at Coles or
Yes.
whatever it is. And
Terrifying.
yeah, we just can't understand how they're just not there anymore.
Yeah.
Could you expand on that? I really enjoyed reading about that.
I think it can help because uh, it's a very visceral or sort of
Mm.
embodied feeling. If you imagine kind of looking up and the legs next to you are not your mom's,
Mm.
or worse, maybe looking down and your child is not next to you anymore and you can't see them, right? And I think it really helps because that visceral feeling is what we call the protest
Mm.
response
Mm.
that we actually see in humans and infants, even in animals, which is a very energizing response. I have to find them. This can't be happening. oh, they're gone,
Mm, mm,
and so I think we can kind of connect with that distress response.
yes.
But there's a second very different response, right? This, what we would call this despair response. And so this idea of, if I say to you, oh, they're gone, in that it's really dawning on you that they're not coming back. You can feel the weight of that, the gravity of that, which is also a very embodied feeling, but is very different,
Mm,
right?
mm,
And what we seem to think is that that despair, although we don't think of despair as being a good thing, and no one should stay in that state, but it does make us stop searching for them,
mm,
right? It Despair does actually resolve the protest part, which is very costly for the body. And so allowing someone to let that sink in,
mm,
that despair moment, is actually supporting them along the learning curve of what is happening and what does this mean.
mm.
But of course, despair leaves out hope. Right.
Right.
So despair isn't the end of the story either, because in that moment where you feel just like the wettest, heaviest blanket is over you, you feel like I will feel this way for the rest of my life
Yeah.
because they're really gone.
Yeah.
And we know that's not true either. That actually people do find ways to restore life even with grief. And that sometimes supporting someone who's in that despair moment is just about lending them your hope. I don't know what your life is going to look like. You don't know what your life is going to look like, but I'll be here with you until we figure that out because
Mm.
it's going to change.
Yes. Yes. Definitely. Definitely. It's such an interesting thing, full disclosure, I read The Grieving Brain when our beautiful pet Bigelia passed away.
Oh,
And I didn't realize how close I was to him
yeah.
until he passed away.
Yes.
And it really, it was a very visceral experience. It's very difficult for me to breathe. The first time we'd go back to the dog park that he always used to come up to us with and all this sort of stuff. Very, very interesting. So I'm sort of watching myself as a psychotherapist going, okay, this is quite fascinating. And then being the human grieving, like it's quite an
Yes.
annoying experience. But definitely something that I think is important for us to touch on here. Um, what are some of the variables, Mary Frances, that make grief much more intense for people?
So many things filter in the role that this person played in your life, sort of how central was this person to your functioning? We think of this with words, right? So if I describe myself, I might say, well, I'm a professor and I'm a daughter, and but that word daughter implies two people in the world, doesn't it? Right?
Mm,
It
mm,
implies that there is someone else who is central to my identity. And I think that the more central a person is in your life, and sometimes that gets revealed with them being ripped away, just as you said, right? Sometimes we discover that a person was really the go-to, that we would turn to when we needed someone, only in their absence, right?
mm,
And so um, that centrality in our life is going to impact then how disruptive and grief-stricken we are afterward.
mm,
Um, there are a host of other things as well. We think of, I think, again, interesting to your comment, people who we feel responsible for. So our children and our pets. That can bring a lot of feelings of guilt with it. And
mm,
some of
mm,
that, I think, is that um, the way that someone died can have an impact on us. So deaths by suicide often lead to a lot of questions and feelings of guilt.
Yeah.
Not correctly applied guilt, but just nonetheless a very human reaction to that. Deaths that are sudden or traumatic. The brain hasn't had any time to even contemplate that this person might not be in the world, and those can lead to very acute reactions. Now,
Mm.
interesting with all of these, it is still the case that the vast majority of us are resilient, that over time we do integrate our understanding of what has happened into our ongoing life, even if our trajectory has taken a bit of a turn. We come to understand how to restore, living loved ones and meaningful activity in our life.
Yes, yes. The guilt point in particular, I'm so happy you brought that up, is a fascinating one, and the mind sort of takes it on as, why didn't I pat him when I left that
Yes.
day, for example,
Yes.
because I was in a rush.
Yes.
Why wasn't I there? Suicide is obviously such an important, like what could I have done more? Perhaps could I have said the right thing? Um,
Yeah.
from the brain's perspective, Mary Frances, could you speak to what's going on there with guilt?
Yeah. In the grieving brain, I write about, largely brought to me a term from a man I know whose son died by suicide, and he calls them the would've, should've, could've
Mm,
thoughts,
mm,
right? And so this is, if only they would have known not to take that last drink, or the doctor should have known to run that other test, or if only I could have gotten them to the hospital sooner.
mm,
But what's fascinating is the human mind can come up with an infinite number of these stories, right? An infinite number of them.
mm,
There is no end to those questions. But what's interesting to think about is each of those stories ends in, and then my loved one would have lived.
mm, mm.
But the reality is that they didn't live. And so while our mind is sort of creating all these other scenarios, we're not necessarily dealing with what it means that they did die.
Yes.
And and so, there's actually we call this the rumination as avoidance sort of hypothesis, right? This idea that spending a lot of time round and round and round and round and round in our thoughts may be a way of protecting us from our feelings, but eventually may sort of get in the way of us having the feelings that are both painful in the present moment, but also the only opportunity to have loving feelings or joyful feelings or creative feelings or proud feelings, right? So when we cut off our feelings, when we just feel numb and we get stuck in our head,
Mm,
we lose the ability to connect in the moment with, your grandchild who's telling you some ridiculous story about monsters, or the barista who just gives you this genuine smile for no reason.
yeah.
And that you could be having that moment right now,
Mm,
but instead you're stuck in your thoughts. And so I think, guilt is something that occurs naturally, but if people are finding they're really challenged by having any other thoughts, or are challenged by a sense of shame for who they are and what they may have done, I think one thing I write about in The Grieving Body that may be useful is my experience is that guilt is sometimes a too narrow lens, right?
mm,
So if you think about the idea that, if you're stuck on, I should have gotten them to the hospital sooner, you have narrowed in on one micro action in a whole host of actions, including, a lifetime of smoking, and
mm,
whether you decided to go to the cabin that weekend, and, who was on call, and right. And
mm,
so you've zoomed in on this one thing, but actually, that's not the only thing that did or did not contribute to an unfolding lifetime of events that led to this moment. And sometimes just pausing and trying to look at this from from a bird's eye view, you can see, wow, lots of people were taking actions and some were helpful and some weren't. And if we look at a longer time period, you could think of all the times you did pet your
Right.
dog before you left, right?
Mm.
Why do we only focus on this one time? We could bring all those other memories to mind as well
Mm.
and kind of give us more perspective that might help in easing those feelings.
Yes, yes, that makes a lot of sense. I suppose one thing that guilt makes me think about as well is it almost seems to be this sort of acute regression back into childlike ways of perceiving the world. So, oh, it must have
Yeah.
been my fault that dad hit me or mum neglected me. I
Yeah.
wonder if that's got something to do with it. We sort of regress back into this, I can't rationalize other viewpoints.
Yeah, I think there's a strong sense of this is an uncontrollable situation, and human beings are very much always looking for control,
Yes.
whether it makes sense or not, right?
Mm,
And this, we're always trying to learn how does the world work, especially when we're children, which is probably part of what makes you think of that. I remember when I was a kid and I used to watch the Bob Newhart show.
mhm.
I'm really old, so and I was convinced that Bob and Emily didn't have children because they lived in an apartment.
Mm, mm.
Because I didn't know anyone who lived in an apartment
Right.
and they didn't have children. So obviously to me, that was the logical
Makes sense.
conclusion, right?
Yep.
I think we are always trying to, something so terrible has happened. We're trying to find a reason why. And unfortunately, in this human existence we have, a lot of things happen randomly. And also, we have to confront the reality that we are all human. We will all die, and we don't know why or for what reason necessarily. So those are big things to have to confront. And I think a sort of childlike, I just want to make this make sense, makes, is understandable.
Yes. Yes. It was really lovely toward the end of the book in part two to read about your take on Irvin Yalom's experience in A Matter of Death and Life. That's such a
Yeah.
beautiful book. But
Beautiful book.
yeah, 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 beautiful. But it just speaks to, I think, what you're describing there, sort of getting used to these existential givens as
Yes.
difficult as that is. But for everyone who perhaps isn't aware, there's a really important point in that book where he starts talking about his own sexual fantasies, right?
Yeah.
And this sort of relationship that he couldn't find, and clearly there isn't much out there in the research about our sexuality impulse sort of increasing or becoming more prevalent in
Yeah.
response to losing a loved one.
Yeah.
I know there isn't a whole lot of research because you mentioned
Yeah.
that, but what are your thoughts on that, Mary
It's
Frances?
such a taboo thing to even say,
Mm, mm,
and yet people describe. I just had an email this week from an older woman who said, I don't know what's happening to me. I'm even having dreams, right?
mm.
Sexual dreams, and I don't understand why, because I'm also bereft over the death of my husband. And I think about it this way. you know, our attachment system, our, attachment neurobiology, all of our hormones and hormonal systems are there to help us connect with other people who we need. Like we need food and water. And so these hormonal systems help us to connect and maintain relationships and to feel secure in the world and to feel like we belong and we're special. And when a loved one dies, those same systems are engaged to understand this person is not here now. This person who was everlasting in my mind. I will always be there for you, and you will always be there for me. So the fact that those hormone systems are being affected And at the same time, we are often in very great need of comfort
Yeah.
when something so tragic has happened. And so I find it a little less mysterious
Mm.
that these shifts in our hormones, other times of our life when we have shifts in our hormones, we experience lots of sexual feelings. So maybe it isn't so foreign that in this moment where our attachment neurobiology is really just cracked open,
Mm.
that we would have all sorts of feelings associated with love and connection and bonding. And at the end of the day, what we know is people simply do. And therefore, it is okay because that is the normal, natural human response for some people to have those feelings. And so I think it's more about our culture than allowing and understanding this is a possible reaction that people have and to destigmatize it because it is happening.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, couldn't agree more with you there, and I know you would have some strong thoughts and feelings about that from the perspective of death and dying, and how our
Yeah.
culture seems to utterly suppress those
Yeah.
truths,
Yeah.
especially in a world now where we all unfortunately seem to be really obsessed with staying young,
Yes.
which obviously would hurt those of us who are alive and who therefore will one day
Yeah.
have to grieve.
Yes.
How do you see that playing out here? More so, I suppose, with clients than the research, but please feel free to touch on both.
Hmm. Hmm. You know, we I've been teaching psychology of death and loss since 1999 to
Mm,
college students. And what is fascinating is I feel that we are in this pendulum swing and that the pendulum is coming back. So
mm,
what I mean by that is, you know, in many ways, it was post World War II. In many ways, it was Victorian England and Queen Victoria herself just before that period, where grief was expressed in a very specific kind of narrow way of behaving with black clothing and sort of stern sort of behavioral constraints and so forth. And after World War II, when there were simply an unimaginable number of deaths, that in many ways, and I think we're seeing this a little bit post-pandemic, the desire to just move forward and kind of wrap all that in cotton wool and put it to one side because it is so much to deal with. I think the sort of keep calm and carry on became a way that people in Western culture started dealing with grief. And
mm,
this happened sort of simultaneously with an increased medicalization and professionalization of death and dying, so that, it was the funeral director, it was the coroner, it was the emergency department doctor who was dealing with the death as it happened. And it wasn't, being at home with the body, with our family and neighbors anymore. So there was sort of putting death and dying behind closed doors and also kind of wrapping our grief in cotton wool and putting it away.
mm.
But I will tell you that since I began teaching that course, there is more willingness to talk about death and loss now. There are more books written, there are more podcasts about it, there are more news stories about the actual grief process
Mm.
than any time in my career. And so I am hopeful that we're kind of turning back towards something we need in dealing with grieving.
Why do you think that is? What do you think's changing in the zeitgeist?
Yeah, I think a couple of things are happening. In the United States, we have a generation we call the baby boomers,
Mm,
the ones who were born after World War II. And the baby boomers have pretty much changed every single, coming of age. They changed our ways of thinking about breastfeeding, suddenly became acceptable as they went through the process. And certainly menopause now was sort of discussed in a way it hadn't been before. And I think the same thing is happening now with death and dying and grieving, that there are a large generational change that says, hey, we can actually talk about this. We could do science about this and then educate people. So I think that's one demographic shift that is happening. I think another is that for the most part, through periods of history and across cultures, human beings need community ways to express grief, to memorialize loved ones, to transform them to ancestors, to remember and celebrate lives and comfort one another. And so I think there's also just a natural way that if a culture tries out for a while not having those options,
True.
it's probably not going to last
Mm.
because we know, in a cross-cultural way, human beings need to express grief and they need to feel community.
Yeah, yeah, it's so true. That's such a good point, isn't it? Yeah, we tried it. Didn't really
We
work.
tried that.
We need to bring it
Didn't
back.
work out so good.
That's right. Um, one of my favorite poems is Home Burial by Robert Frost.
Ah,
Really, really beautiful. And obviously a master of prose. And he writes about a husband and wife who are navigating the loss of their young son, I think it is from memory, and just
yeah,
looking at the different ways in which they're both grieving. And you can
yeah,
see that the wife really wants the husband to be with the feeling, be in
yeah.
that space. My wife leans toward Gestalt psychotherapy
Hmm.
when she does a
Yep.
lot of her work. So oftentimes, it's and what's the feeling here, like, and
Yeah.
what's sort of shining forth, right?
Yeah.
And alternatively, the husband is trying to really understand why that's necessary because
Yeah.
someone still has to unfortunately dig the grave, and she becomes
Yes.
so upset with him that he brings the shovel into the house that he used.
Yeah.
It's such a beautiful dichotomy to watch
Beautiful.
these two very fair and honest ways of grieving.
Yes.
What do you typically see sort of between the sexes here, Mary Frances, in
Mm.
terms of how grieving occurs? And then also, if I could follow up with that question,
Mm.
what could each learn from each other?
Mm. Yeah. I tend not to have I mean, sometimes I think of myself as the Google search engine for grief research.
Yes, yes,
So I'm
yeah,
always like, filing through the studies that I know. And I will say that, gendered responses in grieving is kind of all over the map in the
mm,
research. And I
mm,
think there's a couple of good reasons for that. One is I think we get what we call cohort effects, just the way I was describing. People raised in the baby boomer generation had very gendered roles. And
mm,
so, of course, they were gendered in how they were going to respond to the event of the death of a child or the death of someone. And and that does not always show up in younger generations in
mm.
quite the same gendered ways.
Yes.
I think it also varies so much across our subcultures. So I will tell you that many students in my course tell me that the first time they ever saw their father cry was upon the death of one of his parents.
Mm,
And so there's, in that you both see that it is gendered and also that there is the response. So I think of
mm,
it this way, really. We know that the experience of grief is universal across periods of history, across cultures, probably from what we can tell, even across some animal species. But the expression of that grief varies enormously, varies wildly with different contexts. And so I think, I'll give you the example that after my father died, my sister and I had been able to be in my little tiny hometown and in the house we grew up in for about 10 days
mm,
caring for him. And I had done a lot of hospice work, and so I did a lot, in the hospital and sort of with, the dying process. And then I was just out. I was just spent.
yeah, yeah.
And and I got up the next morning and my sister said something to me along the lines of, I'm not sure why I'm not more upset. And she seemed really guilt-stricken about it. And I looked around and she had created centerpieces for every table for our memorial service. And I said to my sister, you are grieving. This is exactly how you are expressing grief,
mm,
right?
mm,
Crying is only one way. You are doing the thing that makes sense to you, that makes sense to your relationship with our dad, and makes sense to your relationship with our community, where I would show up in my slippers, and be like, well, I hope there's food.
Yes,
Whereas
definitely.
she
I'd be
was
with
able to
you.
bring, right? But she was able to bring everyone in and have them tell stories. And so, in that case, it's not gendered. It's just we responded because we're very different people.
Mm,
I think
mm,
the last thing I'll say about that is I found this to be a very compelling study that has stuck with me, although it's an older study now. It was a study done, a cross-cultural study, but done in a really good way. So it was psychologists from the People's Republic of China, and psychologists from the United States who were co-leading this
mm,
study. And they were looking at patterns of expression of grief in those two cultures. And what was fascinating was they did not find that a particular amount of grief expression was related to better outcomes. But what they did find was that if the amount of grief that the individual expressed was at odds with what their community, what their culture expected them to express, meaning they expressed too much or too little, that they actually had worse grief outcomes. Right. So, not about the expression itself, but how does that expression land? And so often I think it is about, to the degree that we can explain, this is why I feel this motivation to do this in this way. Unfortunately, it's a moment where many of us can't explain that. And the giving each other of a little bit of grace of, I know how central this person was in that, I know how central our child was for this partner of mine. What are the things I can see that are being expressed, even if that's, suddenly he needs to take a walk after dinner by himself. That may be a change of behavior that is very quiet and personal, but might be a deep expression of the grief that he's feeling.
mm. Wow, what a fascinating study that is. That makes me
Isn't it?
sad actually to hear that, that, oh, like my grief is sort of somehow influenced by what I think is correct,
Yes,
you know?
exactly. Because in the moment that we are grieving, in the moment that our one and only is missing,
Mm,
we need the community to hold us like a cast holds a broken bone
mm,
while we figure out how to make it in the world without this person. And so if we are at odds, if what is happening doesn't feel supportive, then we are trying to heal a broken bone without a cast.
mm,
It's not that that community will in any way stop the grief. It's not that any loved one is going to replace or take away the feelings of grief. Nonetheless, we need that support while our grieving body is absorbing the blow of this loss.
mm.
And so I think that's part of why it's so difficult when we have a mismatch between our grief and what we perceive others are expecting of us.
Yeah, and it does make sense, like just as I'm hearing you talk there, it makes sense that I would sort of want to mold my grieving process in a way that I think is conducive to what others can hold or, give capacity for so that I
Yes.
can get that social need met. God,
Yes.
we're fascinating as human beings, aren't we?
Aren't we? And I also think that a lot of what we do, especially early in grief, is just, what do I want to say? Is just reactive. It's
Mm,
not that
mm,
we necessarily sift through, well, these are five possible responses I could have. I wonder which one I'll choose on Monday morning.
mm,
But rather, we're simply reacting to whatever feels whatever comes up, whatever comes out of us. And
Mm,
some of that is going to be shaped by our attachment neurobiology. Some of that's going to be shaped because our blood pressure goes up. And some of that is going to be shaped because of all the ways we have seen human beings grieve before us. Um, in our learning and modeling of grieving from the people around us.
mm. So interesting. Um, you were very open in this book. What was that like for you? That you spoke a lot about your divorce, and I really enjoyed reading a lot about that. Was that healing for you in a sense, or what was it like?
It's a great question. So there, when we're trained as scientists, of course, our own N of one
Yes.
experience, our sample size of one, is not super relevant to
Mm,
what we're doing because we're trying to understand what are the universal principles that are happening in the brain or that are happening in our psychology. And so the first book was a big departure for me, trying to figure out how and whether to include my own experience. But
mm,
what we know from science communication studies is that a reader needs to understand, why is this information important? Why are these facts relevant to me? And one of the ways we best discover that is through the stories of other human beings. If I can share with you how my experience of losing my father was so different and felt so much easier because I knew all of these things about the grief process, then that's going to stick with you in a very different way than if I quote, data and statistical findings
right,
at
right.
you. So I knew that sharing my story would be important, even in the first book,
Mm,
but it's still vulnerable to do that as a human being as well as a scientist. By the time I wrote the second book, The Grieving Body, it became clearer for me, we need examples. We need motivated sort of demonstrations that I get this. I have been through the long night of grief or divorce, or in my case, the diagnosis of a chronic illness of
yes.
multiple sclerosis. And to tell the stories of these principles, to illustrate these scientific principles, the stories are how we remember things. So it became easier for me to do it. Um, it's still, I have moments, right, where I think, oh, I don't want to talk about this today. Today's not one of those moments, but
Yes, yes, yes.
nonetheless, it does it does sort of open your life in a way that sometimes people have chosen science because it is a way to gain distance
Mm,
from things that are very emotional or that feel very existential.
mm,
So it's been an interesting process. I think that, as with all narrative therapy, I certainly discovered things about how my understanding of grieving had changed that were helpful.
mm,
That I had lived a lot of life since my mother died, for example, and since
mm,
I'd had my diagnosis, and reflecting on the things that I had in my own learning curve, um, it helped me to realize the ways I've made meaning, and have integrated those losses. And that was helpful.
It was very helpful for me. I mean, I feel a lot closer to you because I know
Mm,
your story now, at
yeah,
least to the degree that I do. But
yeah,
also it gave me, Mary Frances, a deeper understanding of, the many different forms of grief. When I
yeah.
was reading about your diagnosis,
Hmm.
the grief that comes to mind there is this sort of death of potential identities,
Yeah,
that does take on a form of grief. I do a lot of work in relationships, and
yeah.
oftentimes it comes up when people feel pain and sort of the pang of nostalgia of
Yes.
being single again. Not that they
Yes.
don't want to be in their relationship, but that's just that managing of that old self, right?
Yes.
Um,
Absolutely.
and how that and also, which is something that I wanted to speak to you about. the difference between grieving someone who doesn't exist anymore versus
Hmm.
grieving someone who still does exist but you're no
Yeah.
longer connected to.
Yeah.
Perhaps could you speak to some of your own personal experience and then also what we know from a scientific standpoint?
Yeah. You know, I have spent most of my adulthood living away from my very closest friend who I dedicated the first book to.
Mm.
And I think in part because of that, I've become very aware that she is both my imaginary friend and my real friend, that I spend a lot of time talking with her in my head. And then sometimes those conversations also happen in real time,
Right.
in reality. I think for that reason, it has become very clear to me that we do have both this outer and inner relationship with everyone. And when we have the death of someone, it's the death of them in our outer world, but certainly not the death of them in our inner world. Although that inner world is transformed, of course, by not being able to then have those conversations in reality. But what it has also made me realize is that, when we bond with someone, and some of this is scientific fact and some of this is lived experience, when we fall in love with the person who becomes our spouse or we fall in love with our baby, there is an implicit belief that develops then, which is, I will always be there for you and you will always be there for me.
Mm.
And I believe that is ingrained, encoded in a very deep and literal way in the brain. The always, the everlasting
Mm.
aspect. This is what I call the gone, but also everlasting hypothesis. So when a relationship changes so that that is not true, the most obvious way being through death. Of course, they aren't there for you in the sense that they are not physically on this planet, but other things change that relationship as well. Divorce means I will not be here for you in the way that we had intended. And so that kind of grief that emerges says, this implicit belief you have is no longer true. And now you have to figure out how to walk around in the world, given you have that implicit belief
Mm.
and it is not true.
Mm.
And that takes a lot of mental gymnastics. That's a big
Mm.
learning curve to figure out how to do that. And I think we see it in other contexts as well. I mean, even the empty nest, right? You
Yeah.
raise children with the intention of them leaving home, and then they leave home, and it is terribly burdensome with grief in their absence, even though it's exactly what was intended to happen,
Mm. Mm.
right? Because you're not able to be there for them in the same way that you were.
Mm.
Or estrangement, or breakup, or all sorts of ways that relationships shift.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. It's true. And it gives us what's the feeling I'm having right now? Like a somber feeling, I think, to some
Yes.
degree, that,
Yeah.
everything that we love will inevitably
Yeah.
depart.
Yes.
Um, how do people find hope then through that grieving experience?
I think, I was reading a book today, a wonderful book called Renegade Grief that just came out today,
Oh,
actually.
wow. Okay.
Marvelous book, Carla Fernandez. And she was describing grief in some ways as a rite of passage. The idea that once we experience deep loss, that most of us will, but many of us not until our third or fourth or fifth or sixth decade,
Mhm.
which is unusual, but can happen, especially in modern society with long life expectancies. The idea that it's almost a rite of passage because now we understand something that isn't just true, this person died and that changed my life, but people die and it changes our lives. And so that wisdom, there's almost no other way to come to that knowledge, that truth about the transience of life until you experience a loss, but it has always been true, even
Mm,
though you didn't know it. So it's not that the death brings you this new knowledge, it's that this knowledge is revealed that was always true. And so in that sense, it gives me two things. The sort of easier conclusion then to jump to. Easier is the wrong word. One way that we sometimes make sense of that in our world is that because we deeply understand things are transient, we enjoy things in a new way.
mm,
I love this conversation because who knew this morning if I would actually get to talk to you, right?
yeah,
If
yeah.
this conversation would actually happen. Who knew? But it is happening. Isn't that
Mm,
incredible, right? On the other hand, I think the second piece of it that can be helpful is just you make more authentic and wise decisions because you do know how reality works now in a new way.
mm,
And it may mean you just don't care about some of the social niceties in a way that you once did, for example, and that, you know, that's a really authentic way to live, to know what matters to you, to know who matters to you, to know what is meaningful and to pursue that against all the intransience of possibilities.
mm. Yeah, I love that. I think that's so true, isn't it? It's okay, given now that I'm starkly aware that this is going to happen to everyone I love and to me,
Yeah.
what do I do about it? You
Yep,
know?
exactly. And
Yeah.
these are some of the existential questions, aren't they? I mean, this is then where, and I hate the word existential. And the reason I hate it is because in college I took a class that was supposed to be 20th century literature, and I thought, ooh, this will be interesting. And then it was German existentialism.
Oh, I see.
And I felt like I just didn't understand what that word meant.
Yeah.
At the end of the class, I felt like I didn't understand what that word meant. And and what's so interesting is with loss, I feel like it's the problem of how do we exist,
Mm,
which is of course the base of the word existential, but
mm.
how do we exist given what we now know? You know, how
Yes,
do we
yes.
decide to get up in the morning or not? And then once we've gotten up, how do we decide what to do? And these are the existential issues around freedom
Mm,
and managing isolation and loneliness. And and these are real questions we can come to grapple with. Fortunately, if we have other human beings around us who have maybe thought through some of these questions before, that could be a therapist, that could be an author, that could be your grandmother, that could be your grandchild.
mm,
If we are in conversation with people who are also wrestling with these questions, it can bring a great depth and authenticity to that relationship.
mm. Which to me, I know exactly what you mean about the word sort of getting in the way, because it
Yeah.
sounds like this big giant fancy word that really is
Yeah.
just trying to grapple with the conditions of life. You know,
Hmm.
it's just this is what we're doing here. These are the rules. Like
Hmm.
if you want to play soccer well, you're gonna have to know there's something called offside, right?
That's right. Exactly. Well put.
Right. But it prevents a lot of people, I think, from entering into a space that is so necessary for us to have
Yeah.
great lives. You
Yes.
know.
And in many ways, I think, organized religion has upsides and downsides. One of the upsides is that certainly that is a group of people, those who are in organized religion, who have thought through many of these questions. Now, not all of them have come to the same conclusions that each one of us might, but it was always clear where we might go to have one of these conversations. If you had a priest, even if you are contemplating the loss of a loved one for the first time in your life, in your 40th, year, at least if you had a relationship with a priest, it was something you could go and talk about with them. You knew that they would be open to that conversation, even if you didn't necessarily like the answer. But with fewer and fewer of us having organized religion as a part of our daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly life experience, it means that many of us, I think, are left with the questions with no obvious places where we go and ask the questions.
Mm.
And I think that is some of the worst feeling of having these questions and feeling alone because you think you're the only one having them.
Mm. Yes, yes, couldn't agree more. Wow, yeah, that's so true, isn't it? Wow, I don't think anyone knows here.
Yeah.
Science has taken us to the point where we kind of, can be skeptical at the very least about what may happen when we die. And but
Yeah.
what do I do now? How do I make sense of
Yeah.
all these feelings? You
Yes,
know,
exactly.
it's Mary Frances, we have to do this again. I've really, really enjoyed this
Yes,
conversation. There's so many
me
more
too.
things that I want to ask you, but in the spirit of time here, um, for you, I've got such a good understanding now as to how you find meaning in the world and what really sort of motivates you to continue forwards. Um, are there any questions that, as scientists or as researchers like yourself, that we don't know about grief or haven't fully come to make sense of yet that is really alluring for you that you really want to get into?
Oh my goodness, so many questions.
Where do I start?
But I will say that some of the big questions that I think we really kind of need to understand and we don't really have the research base for. I think one of the biggest ones is that people who study the psychological reaction in loss are often very different people who those to those who study the physiological
Mm,
reactions in loss. And I think that a question that we need to understand better is it the people who continue to have the intense and frequent waves of grief, who, a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years are still grieving, wave after wave, hit after hit? Are those the people who are also having more medical problems?
mm,
Right? Is that part of the connection that the body is not absorbing because the mind is tumultuous, right? So I think understanding the connection between our emotional response and our physical response, especially as we get past, the first few months, is something I don't think we understand well. I can't tell you the answer.
mm,
Historically, the answer was that if you didn't express your grief, that you would have physical ailments. But that's not really being played out in the literature, so in
mm.
the scientific study. So we don't really know. That's one of the big ones in my mind.
Well, that's interesting, and I mean, anecdotally, that was very true for me. Like, I've got your book right here,
Yeah.
everybody. Good to buy your stuff as well. I the reading in part one about the respiratory system was actually really
Yeah.
important for me. It really helped
Yeah.
because I'm a big lover of words and emotions and literature
Yeah.
and all this sort of stuff. I mean, I'm married to another therapist, so I'm
Right.
not really getting anywhere if I'm holding it in, right? But when our big Lear passed away,
Yeah.
I was talking and crying all the time, not because I was trying to, it's just it was my natural reaction. And yet still I felt that I couldn't really take a full breath in. I was very, very
Yes.
short up here and I would get a lot of chest
Yes.
pain and I was trying to do all the exhaling and all that sort of stuff. So I thank you, I suppose is what I'm saying for helping
Yeah.
me understand this because like I said in the beginning of our chat today, um, I had come from that psychological background of understanding the inner world. So it's
Yeah.
nice for me to know how the body was responding to this.
Yeah.
But also, and just to close here, I think you do a really great job. I've read both your books now, and I really feel you've done such a fantastic job of disseminating scientific ideas in a way that actually most of us can understand. It was really, really, really cool how you did that. So thank you.
Marvelous. Yes, I credit many, many students who looked at me puzzled like, I don't know what you mean, and I found another way to say it. And
Yes,
hopefully the book's benefited from that.
definitely. Well, tell me where people can find the book, Mary Frances, and also if people want to connect with you or find out a little bit more about what you're researching and what you're up to, where can people go?
Well, the book is available anywhere books are sold. There's also an ebook version and an audio version, and I actually read the audio
Oh,
version of the
cool.
new
Okay.
book. And I my lab and the work that I do is at maryfrancesoconnor.org.
MaryFrancesO'Connor.org. Beautiful.
Yep,
Love it. We'll put that in the show notes and we'll have
brilliant.
to do this again sometime. I really
Yes,
enjoyed
I'd
it.
love that, Tom.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.